a happy Republic Day to one and all present here. Let me try to share with you some best practices in teaching and learning in the higher education institutions. Education has become so competitive, and so too the educational institutions today. In order to survive the competition, institutions have to improve the quality of their services. Changes in culture, aspirations, and levels of skills required in securing employment for students force higher education institutions today to rework on their educational models and add value to each and every aspect of their services. Innovations and best practices serve to enhance the quality and add value to the system. Higher education is a change resistant enterprise. Academic culture, faculty governance, and an unusual bureaucracy all work together to slow down evolution. In this part of this lecture, let us try to understand how best practices for teaching and learning enables higher education to succeed and survive. The best practices for teaching and learning actually integrates the wealth of institutional knowledge with current educational research. Why do we need a system to critically implement strategies for social, economical, and technological development? Creation of new knowledge, paramount concern of higher education. Developing young minds to grapple with the emerging concerns and imperative of the future. Facilitate in designing interventions to ensure equity is a platform for breaking the isolation across knowledge domains to usher in multi and interdisciplinary blossoming of qualitative aspects of knowledge, setting up new institutions with a predominant focus on quality, uneven distribution of resources favoring small systems. Now let us try to understand why this best practices becomes a benchmark in higher education institutions. The traditional Indian teaching learning system has been driven by the Guru Shishya Parampara. It's a holistic system which provided comprehensive knowledge, value-based learning, as well as a requisite for life skills suited to the learners. Diverse pedagogies have been used, which included exposure to real-life experiences and hands-on learning, value-based learning through stories, narrations, and dissemination through debates and discussions. In the past few decades, various policy frameworks have been developed to address the evolving needs of different pedagogical approaches in higher education. Is also the outcome of this mammoth exercise to integrate Indian traditional value-based education with the present technology-dominated teaching and learning process. It aims to overhaul the existing education system through a multi-pronged approach, one of which is developing a pedagogy that makes holistic, integrated, inquiry-driven, discovery-oriented, learner-centered, discussion-based, flexible, and enjoyable. As the NEP strives to develop well-rounded, competent individuals with the 21st century skills, the curricula and pedagogies have to be reoriented and revamped for the same, which includes raising the standard of curricula and to deliver effectively to the learners. Recognizing that teaching is both an art and a science, while skills of teaching are widely researched and described, they are rarely rewarded. Because of this, we are not able to have a common language of best practices. Let us try to understand why this best practices has a huge impact in the benchmarking of the higher education institutions. Benchmarking as such is a continuous and self-improvement tool. It is a way of comparing, finding, and adopting which are the best practices just adoptable. Also, try to figure out which are the idealized best practice approaches which an institution can use Generally, it is activity-based benchmarking. This benchmarking strengthens institutions increasingly in a competitive environment. Also, this enables institutions to have a unique identity in the educational sector. Having said, there are a lot of challenges which institutions come across. So just quote a quality has become both a national and international dimensions, and we are aware there are a lot of foreign institutions trying to have its base in the country like India today. Massification meeting social demands but not employer demands due to skill mismatch. Employability becomes a question. Emphasis should be on core functional outcomes. Weeding out excellence in curricular provisions is also a challenge. Quality requires testing of curriculum on high order ability. Teaching becomes a powerful instrument to bring out the reality of practice. Now, how do we try to understand and imbibe this quality in it? We should find out some strategies to make students learn, and it could be a learner centric approach. Yes, try to carve out a strategy how students would be able to learn, identify what are the areas students might be interested in learning. We can use an active learning tool, try to create small groups. We'll see in detail as we move forward. We need to have some sort of assessment enable students to think that they can learn using powerful teaching strategies. We can teach at larger classrooms, concise it into smaller groups using one of the best instructional technology. Evaluate our teaching, evaluate self-teaching. We can use in our day-to-day teaching life to see which best strategy works out well depending upon the scenario. One other main feature is in best practices is that we need to hold students accountable. Today, a lot of distractions are amidst the student community because of the informational technology era. Students are and sometimes what we actually try to
Excuse me, ma'am.
we need yes ma'am.
Ma'am, your voice is breaking at times, ma'am. Can you just check?
My internet is stable.
So,
I don't know. Just
okay, ma'am. You can
okay.
continue.
So these are the strategies or maybe the course of action one can plan to make a classroom interesting where students are made accountable. We need to define a good presentation which will help students to understand better. Create a stake accountability subject. The student is responding to all our questions. Explain the purpose of accountability and strategy to the students so they make themselves accountable. Use class time to deepen students' understanding and ability. Sometimes students need some time to get themselves used to your presentation. So, one main attribute where we need to enhance it is make the students accountable for learning. These are some best teaching practices. Normally, as teachers, we use it in our regular mode of teaching, instruction based, community based, like now to emphasize on student emphasize on practice and students' effort. Try to design a curriculum in such a way that and you impart the methodology such a way it is individualized to student capacity, provide a variety of like resources for the student to use to try to understand which could be suitable for them. Emphasize on higher thought skills. Very much essential, especially in the higher education sector. Let us try to understand what are the goals for quality teaching. As college teachers, no, becoming an excellent college teacher is a continuous, lifelong professional challenge, the dimensions of which often goes unrecognized. In general, in people's psychology, doctors and lawyers are professionals or not. Why such a situation amidst when we give our best in the profession what we do? There's a list of best practices which could be like developed and explicitly explained to all. But prior to that, as teachers, we need to have these goals practiced. College teachers could find consensus on an ever-evolving definition of what constitutes best practices in this amorphous and complex endeavor. Senior faculty could assume a responsibility to develop additions and modifications to the best practices list and actively transmit these practices to the new faculty. We all could ensure that our colleagues and institutions apply the set of best practices for the ultimate welfare of the learners. If, as faculty, we could ever come upon an agreed performance list, our institutions could marshal these resources to accelerate its attainment, clarify the objective for an individual's continued reflective review of teaching practices. Therefore, these best practices chosen focus on the aspects of classroom teaching competence which are visible to oneself and others, become useful for formative evolution. Generally, when a component it is actually based on conformable performances rather than minutely or technically not remotely abstract. That's how professionals must engage themselves in reflective practice. The best practices in teaching, as described by philosophers and management gurus, are explained with the help of two different philosophers. Let us try to understand. Teaching excellence is the contested definitions which connote the meaning of excellence. But let us try to understand from the words of Graham Gibbs. He has identified the key features that determines a positive learning experience for students. Graham Gibbs says, what best predicts educational gain is a measure of educational process. What institutions do with their resources to make the most of whatever students they have. The process variables that best predict gains are not to do with the facilities themselves, but concern a small range of fairly well understood pedagogical practices that engender student engagement. Another important author, Elton, says teaching excellence is in 5 parts. It is all interrelated and each part is intertwined. Without the other, it doesn't have meaning. Let us try to understand what are those 5 parts. Teaching excellence is a multi-dimensional concept and its different dimensions call for different form of recognition and reward. If teaching quality is to be maintained and enhanced, teaching excellence must be recognized and rewarded. That's the first part. The criteria for individual teaching excellence are no more difficult to enunciate and to evaluate than those for far research excellence. be applied fairly as long as those who judge excellence lack the training for the task. A prerequisite for real teaching excellence is the individual level is a trained teaching profession, a way forward which links staff development directly to the process of analyzing but not as a sufficient condition for an excellent student learning experience. Thoughts on the best practices in teaching excellence. Now, what are the main patterns in teaching and learning? Let us try to deep dive into it. A focus on the student, on student learning, and on a personal support for students and their development rather than on formal teaching. I'm just trying to share some of the best ideas when it comes to the best practice of teaching and learning. A macro focus on the wider learning environment and the development of the a traditional emphasis on the teacher themselves and the student feedback ratings on teacher, on the teacher's research record and subject knowledge, and also on the external recognition of the teacher, with little focus on students, on learning, on the learning environment, or on the process of developing teaching. An emphasis is on efforts to develop teaching, especially through innovation, thorough influencing through influencing others, level.
Uma, ma'am? Dear participants, our
I
research person
think
will
there's
join us soon.
some sort of
Share some.
technical glitch. Just give me a minute. Uh, yeah,
Yes,
because
ma'am.
there is some issues in the internet, I believe. Just get. I think it's visible now.
Yes, on the
Yeah.
screen is
So I
visible.
was trying to talk to you about the main patterns in teaching and learning. Now, well, let us try to understand the characteristics of an excellent teacher. I've just given you the main characteristics. There are a lot. The list is a huge list, which we need to follow regularly and consistently. One is the enthusiasm what we show in day-to-day teaching life, clarity of thoughts, preparation and organization of our teaching materials and information, stimulating and the love of knowledge we have for the domain in which we are experts. Let us try. There are different teaching techniques which are like practiced today. We call it as blended learning. We call it as flipped learning. There are numerous types we have. We have like different pedagogical. In a general parlance, let us try to understand. Maybe these are some sort of insights which we normally follow, but let us try to look in how it has to be done. A classroom presentation or maybe like a class session has got three parts. One is the beginning, the session, ongoing session, and the closing of the session. Normally, when we try to understand what could be the best way of trying to gauge the attention of students? When we begin a class, we need to make them understand the learning objectives and the level of mastery, what is expected for the particular session. Share with the class the learning objective for what that session is conducted so that the students also understand why the content is important and also the level of mastery. Today, thanks to the Bloom's taxonomy, which identifies the critical learning objectives, sometimes using an example, trying to gauge the attention of the listener, raising a question, telling them that it will be answered at the end of the session. All these things will generally intricate them, trigger them an interest in the class. During the process of the session, allow for some flexibility in the content to be presented in order to respond to the students' questions and comments. Determine the key points to be developed during the class session. This all helps us to get prepared how to deliver a session effectively. Try to understand the every nuances, details, and instance of a topic which has to be discussed, or where there are too many ideas to be presented, not well developed. Sometimes students often lose sight of the main idea. Organize the material in some logical order based on your subject, based on the importance, based on the learning objective, and the level of mastery a student requires. Now, when we try to come to the close of this session, answer those questions raised at the beginning of the lecture that will help students learn. Provide a closure for the lecture. For example, trying to summarize briefly the lecture material or the preview which lies ahead. Try to identify different phases of reflective thinking process, trying to make them understand how these phases can be used for a better understanding. Relate the lecture material to the past or future presentations, trying to make them know that the next lesson will have some discussions which will be based on the session taught priorly, or ask a student to summarize the lecture's key ideas, the key issues developed during the lecture. Restate, that's the main practice, restate what we expect from the students to gain from this lecture, and provide the student time to retrospect and reflect on the session taught. How could an effective classroom environment be? Creating a safe and a positive classroom environment is the key to effective teaching and learning. Generally, this helps us to understand how to keep our students motivated, how to prevent and detect and deal with cheating during the session. Plagiarism, on the other hand, prevent any incivility happening inside the class. The student participants come from diverse backgrounds, so create an inclusive classroom. Try to prevent harassment and discrimination, and try to conduct ourselves and expect the students to have a professional code of conduct. Another way of trying to enhance a teaching learning is leading discussions. By engaging students in discussions, we can help them to think about subject matter in an unexplored ways, learn to evaluate their own and others' perspective, articulate what they have learned or what needs to be learned, provide motivation to study the topic further. The next part of this relates to the best practice wherein we create an environment for the student to lead into discussion. Students will participate more readily if they feel they are accepted by other students and experience a sense of belonging in the class. We can facilitate this by greeting students each day, helping students to get to know each other by doing an icebreaker activity, learning our students' name, calling on them in positive ways, if possible. Let us try to have or let us try to be present for a talk with them before and after the class. This is also one practice which helps them, which makes students happier, contented, resourceful about a class. When we go with a discussion pattern of teaching, we need to be prepared with a variety of discussion in case interaction starts. Start with a common experience, something all our students can relate to. We can use a demonstration, a film clip, or a cartoon, or a story, or an anecdote, or a personal experience, or an expert excerpt from a reading which is relevant to your domain, which is very much associated with your field of teaching. Or it could be starting with a controversy, choosing an issue that fits with the material we are teaching. Try to use this controversy to elicit discussion from both the viewpoints. And when everyone agrees on one particular position, there's a little room for discussion. And another way could be open with a question. This is probably the most common technique, but to be more effective, it needs a complete planning, a very effective planning of what is the topic which is to be discussed. Let us try to understand. There are a lot of technologies available, techniques available. It's like it differs from a large classroom, a small classroom. There are students can be grouped in case you need to have an activity based learning. Students can be grouped in groups or in pairs. This all depends upon the magnitude of your topic, the reachability of your topic. Continuous assessment techniques is one form of assessment which is mainly trying to garner these three ideologies. One is that we need to assess the learner's attitude, values, and self-awareness. And the third parameter is assessing learner's reaction to instructions. Let us try to understand the best practices we normally use in a classroom environment or the teaching and learning process. The predominant one seems to be the project-based learning. This learning methodology is a teaching methodology which is really complex, real-world problems are used as a vehicle to promote student learning of concepts and principles as opposed to direction like how we normally do presentation of facts and concepts. In addition to the course content, a PBL methodology can promote the development of critical thinking skills, problem solving abilities, and communication skills. It also provides opportunities for working in groups, finding and evaluating research materials, and lifelong learning. PBL can be incorporated into any learning situation, no matter the domain or no matter the area we teach. This approach is used to the entire, it can be used as an entire semester as a primary method of teaching. This is more commonly seen in lab-oriented, lab-integrated classes. And it also starts with a single discussion and triggers students to understand the main idea behind us, it connects the various users in the real world problem. The case methodology, and a very interesting technique, teaching technique, which helps the students to understand the situation in a in-depth manner, is case methodology. These are narratives, situations which select data sampling or statements that present unresolved and provocative issues, situations, or questions. The case method is a participatory, discussion based way of learning where students gain skills in critical thinking, communication, and group dynamics. Very idealized type of problem based learning. It's seen in the professional schools of medicine, law, and businesses. It is now used successfully in disciplines such as engineering, chemistry, education, and journalism. Students will be given the case during a class and as a whole in small or groups. In addition to this, a case method of teaching or learning is a partnership between students and teacher as well as among students. This promotes more effective contextual learning and a long-term retention. Ideally, it involves a trust that students will find the answers. It also answers the questions of not only of how, but why. It provides students the opportunity to walk around the problem and to see the varied perspectives of a particular situation. Very predominantly used these days as one of the best teaching practice. Community-based learning, it is called as service learning. Today, many institutions, higher education institutions, have this practice of doing it as a service learning. It is actually based on learning important facts, growing emphasis on the application of these facts to solve the problem in real life context outside the university setting. Students are expected to be familiar with more than the traditional subject areas. It is important for them to think critically, collaborate with others, fit into an increasingly diverse community, and make a smooth transition from school to work. The context of what is to be learned is changing, and thus these methodologies of teaching and learning must change as well. Service learning is a form of teaching that combines instruction with meaningful community service experience. It represents a holistic approach that reinvigorates the linkages between young people and the institutions that serve the broader community. Models of community-based learning. One is service learning course. It relates to community-based service experience to course objectives using a structured reflection and learning activities in a regular academic course. Then another mode of doing this is university community partnership, where an ongoing relationship between the university, maybe like no micro terms department or a faculty, and community partners in which students are involved in service learning by doing. Internship, practicum, or field experience help students to select some service sites where they work individually, apply their knowledge and skills to complete their hours of service. One of the widely practiced model across all higher education institutions, which has got a very good rewards and far-reaching benefits. Then another model of trying to understand, which inculcates learning and quick learning and long retention of the materials and resources and the concepts, is group learning. There are basically two widely accepted principles about learning. One is learners construct their own knowledge, and learning is an inherently social phenomenon. Support the use of group learning. Working in small groups provide learners with opportunities to articulate ideas and understanding. It uncovers assumptions and misconceptions and negotiate with others to create products or reach consensus. Group activities enable students to discover deeper meaning in the content and improve thinking skills. The most effective use of group work is that which engages students with a higher level of content that is thought provoking, difficult to understand, or has multiple interpretations. This helps the learning process in terms of collaborative learning and cooperative learning, which is used interchangeably but has a distinction. Collaborative learning highlights the contribution of individual group members, stress the sharing of authority, and leads to a dialogue and consensus building on topics without a clear right or a wrong answer. Group governance, group processing remain in the hands of students. Cooperative learning, on the other hand, is often a subset of collaborative learning that involves more teacher intervention. Here, the instructor designs the task and a group structure for accomplishing the task, including the assignment of roles to group members. These are some of the recent evolved techniques which helps in getting the best of the student, like a jigsaw technique, trying to give a problem or a topic and asking the students to analyze from multiple perspectives, a round table where there's a prompt given and students try to record a response to the prompt. Center problems or issues that are identified by groups or by the instructor. They propose a solution, direct essay confrontation, reading a material and they come out with a response for some questions. Inquiry-based learning. We have seen what is case studies. Bus groups are created to bring in the concept of innovation. Like research-based education is one recent tool evolved. Team-based learning is again a very important best practice which could be used in teaching. Problem-based learning, peer assessment of students' work. All these things highlight there are numerous techniques available, and the only concern is as teachers, we need to understand what could be used which will suit our domain, which will enhance our students' learning, which will help them to develop a conceptual understanding in depth, not as a surface learning. It should be a deep learning which helps them to get themselves competent and trying to be the successful prospective candidate for employment. One other concept is just-in-time teaching. This involves students in the learning process through a two-step series of learning activities. The students complete a focused set of activities outside the class and submit the work to the instructor. In the second step, the instructor collects the students' responses and identifies the areas of understanding and misunderstanding to adjust to the next session so that the students can receive a specific just-in-time feedback on those particular areas. Very popular these days it is. The purpose of this is to encourage more student responsibility for learning the content outside the class, maximize the efficiency of class time, or to allow to more focused and more meaningful exploration of content and have more time for interaction and discussion. Instructors who use just-in-time teaching also find that their students are more active. The recent research says this. They are more active and more interested than they would be in the traditional teaching methodology. Since many students will not read a textbook, but they'll like to watch a video or listen to an audio too, many instructors elected to use the short video lectures like podcast or video via iTunes as a starting point for learning process in just-in-time teaching. See, there are numerous methodologies which could be used, which could be widely practiced. In the broader sense, when we try to understand, as we try to, as teachers, we try to evolve the best practices. And today, these best practices in teaching and learning undoubtedly create a value for a higher education institution. And all of us are like, basically discovering the concept of excellence. And these best practices will definitely help us to excel in the area of research and teaching, trying to create an environment where we are evaluated on what we deliver is what we promise, and make our higher educational institutions to be an institution of outstanding quality, and try to provide the best so that the students doesn't have a compromise on academic quality standards, in which excellence relates to teaching quality, capabilities of students, and the scale of resource provision and the level of student achievement. So I think assessing the quality of teaching, helps in bringing out novel ideas, novel best practices, and help in student understanding, student learning, so that we stand competitive among the other institutions and trying to march forward with all the best practices one could innovate and inculcate in the real time learning. And to just give you a summary of a quick understanding, three essential areas of best practices for teaching and learning is to create a student-centered learning environment, examine how physical setup and teacher role affects student expectations, build relationships that promote a safe and a positive environment in which students are responsible, self-motivated, and self-evaluating. So whenever we try to carve in some techniques as best practice, these three has to identify, fall in line with it, essentially fall in line with it. And how do we assess the student learning? Adapt teaching based on evidence to meet the needs of students, check student progress in meeting standards and learning goals, actively involve students in assessment to promote continuous learning, and inform students, parents, and others about the student achievement. Plan and teach for student learning. When we plan the assignments and assessments, have in mind the standard of learning. Purposefully plan to adjust teaching practices to meet the needs of individual strategies. Employ teaching strategies, techniques, resources to meet all the needs of students. Be responsive as students are diverse in nature. The standard of the students are diverse. We cannot adopt or accustom to one particular teaching methodology. It has to be diversified teaching methodology. I think I have been able to share with you. I believe also most of the best practices as teachers, we all of us follow and practice in our respective educational institutions. And let us try to build up an institution which has quality best practices, which caters to the students' diverse needs, and be an example for all the higher educational institutions in the country and across the globe. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I thank the IoT Academy for providing this opportunity. and also the participants, the learned and erudite faculty members present in this platform for the patient listening. And over to you, madam. Thank you.